In 1306 to 1307, King Philip IV of France and fellow Frenchman Pope Clement V declared the Knights Templar to be heretics, persecuted them, and stole their vast wealth. A number of knights were arrested and tortured, including their Grand Master. The torture included branding, eye gouging, stretching on the rack, and more. What were the knights' supposed crimes? Satanic blood rituals, a two-faced skull, kissing each other on the feet, navel and neck, and much, much more. We now know that the knights had been the target of a conspiracy to seize their immense wealth. The French king owed the Templars large amounts of money, which he had neither the ability nor the desire to repay. The Pope was jealous and anxious about the power, wealth, and popularity of the knights. Plus, he wanted some cash too. Welcome back to Copernicus's Galaxy. Who were the Knights Templar, and how did they get so rich? The Knights Templar, more formally known as the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, organized during the time of the early Crusader period, 1095 to 1149, when Christians of Western Europe sailed, walked, and rode to the Holy Land to expel the infidels, as they called the Muslim rulers in the area, who were now in possession of some of Christendom's holiest sites. Interestingly, the Muslims called the Christians the same thing. It was hoped by the Catholic Church and the Catholic kings of Europe that the Crusaders, the word crusade comes from Latin, meaning military mission or expedition under the banner of the cross, would drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land, which consisted mostly of today's Israel and Palestine, but included parts of Jordan and Syria. But though the initial crusade did drive Muslim rulers out of many important Christian sites, it soon became apparent that they were gone for good. A long and protracted battle begun, and the men of Western Europe, those who lived or weren't captured and sold into slavery, wanted to go home. They weren't professional soldiers, and they had hoped that their victories would be permanent. Over time, many of those men headed home, and when they did so as individuals or in small groups, perfect targets for thieves and marauding Muslim soldiers. Reports of these incidents reached the ears of nobleman Hugh de Payens at his home in France, and he determined to do something about it. We should tell you that Hugh de Payens may or may not have been a real person, because there is a scant record of him, and that is very incomplete. Whether it was Hugh de Payens, someone else, or even a group of people does not matter. What does is that in 1118 or 1119, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon journeyed to the Holy Land to protect the men, many of whom who have come on crusades with their families, from thieves. Like many other orders at the time and later, the knights were primarily noblemen, at least at first. They also, like the famous Knight Hospitallers, cared for the sick and wounded. Many of them had some experience at arms, either through combat experience or martial training that noblemen were expected to go through at the time. When they arrived in Jerusalem, King Baldwin II, a Frenchman, gave them a part of the royal palace for their own. It stood on the land rumored to be the location of the biblical Temple of Solomon. This is how the knights, each of whom was called a Templar, got their name. The Templars not only escorted people to and from pilgrimage sites once they arrived in the Holy Land. In addition, they had received the blessing of the Catholic Church to establish their prefectories, their own monastic buildings, which were more like fortresses throughout much of Western Europe and the Christian-controlled parts of the Middle East. They had their own headquarters, but the Pope and several other regional and local churches and governing officials also gave them two crucial rights. The first was that the Templars did not have to pay taxes to the church, kings, or nobility for the lands they used. Additionally, the church and many members of the ruling classes in Western Europe denoted vast tracts of land to the Templars, from which the knights collected taxes and tithes. For the first 100 years or so, the Templars were the most respected, revered, and rewarded of the military orders. Among the ordinary people, the Templars were respected for aiding pilgrims and caring for the wounded and sick. But most importantly, they won victories over the Muslims in the early days of their existence. But, of course, not every battle the Templars fought was a victory. At times, their fighting prowess was the only bright spot within a more extensive military defeat. Still, their reputation as fanatic Christian warriors who would rather die than to be captured, and their skill at arms won them renown and more land. With land came taxes and donations, for it was believed that many at the time that donating to the Templars or other orders, military or not, would result in a blessing from above for the giver. Through taxes, tithes, and donations, the Templars became incredibly wealthy. What's more, within a relatively short period, they had established prefectories throughout Catholic Christendom. Given the nature of life in the 13th and 14th centuries, the prefectories began to serve as some sort of primitive bank, first at a local level, then throughout much of Western Europe. This benefited people going on crusades and also made the first job of the Templars easier. For example, a family in Jerusalem wishing to return to Italy could carry all of their wealth back home with them and risk being robbed, with or without Templar protection, or they could take their wealth to the Templar prefectory before they left. There, Templars would assess the value of the deposit, work out an agreement, and write what was essentially a primitive check, a parchment that the departing pilgrims would take to the prefectory in their homeland for a stated value in coin. The Templars also got into money-lending businesses, and though the Catholic Church frowned on collecting interest, the Templars got around that rule easily. Many historians count the Templars as the first actual multinational corporation. Inside the Templars. Most of the medieval people we read and see movies about are knights. Aside from their armor, duels, romantic tales, and brave deeds, the reasons that the knights are the people we hear about from time to time is because they were from the upper classes. Generally speaking, the upper class, which at this time were either members of the nobility or the clergy, were the only ones able to read and write. Even many nobles couldn't read, but they loved having tales told about them and written about them. Besides, the truth is that no one really cared enough about the mass of the people to write much down about them. So we hear about the knights. Of course, that's not the only reason. Knights, whether they were Templars, Knights of Malta, Teutonic Knights, and any of the many other orders, were the elite warriors of the time. So that begs the question, if there weren't that many knights, meaning men who fought, how did the Templars run this large, early, multinational empire they built so quickly? In this case, the word knight is kind of a misnomer. Not everybody in the Poor Knights of Christ and Temple of Solomon was a warrior, but he was a knight for Christ. He worked in his way towards one goal, the protection and spread of Christianity. The actual warriors themselves were a minority within the order. One could not be a mounted knight without a couple of things. First and foremost, a title, such as Duke, Prince, Count, etc. No one without noble blood could be a mounted knight. What's more, no one without title could likely afford the 3 or 4 horses needed by a mounted knight. Horses and their care cost money, and so did the squires, usually young nobles, who took care of them for the night. While it is the mounted knights that are most recognizable to us today, with their white mantle and red cross, the Templar foot soldiers wore a black mantle with a red cross. The armed forces of the Templars consisted of far more than armored and mounted knights. Knights on horseback formed the shock troops of the Templar and other orders, but without foot soldiers, they could not have sustained a battle, nor permanently taken or defended land. At their height, the Templars had tens of thousands of dedicated warriors at their command through Europe and the Holy Land. Other knights did the more mundane jobs of the order. These jobs included not only the maintenance and cleaning of the prefectories, but growing, purchasing, and preparing food, clothes, and the necessities of life. And as the success of the Templar banks began, more and more brothers became accountants and a type of early banker. Many of them traveled throughout Europe, lending money, and this is where the trouble eventually began. Nightfall. The most famous Templar victory came in 1177 at the Battle of Montgisard in the Holy Land. There, about 500 mounted knights and a few thousand infantry defeated the brilliant Muslim leader Saladin and his more than 25,000 soldiers. Unfortunately, 10 years later, the Templars and others were defeated by Saladin in the Battle of Hattin, which led to the reconquest of Jerusalem by the Muslims. This was a huge blow to not only the Templars, but all of Christendom. The city was recaptured briefly, about 50 years later, but the Templars had no part in the fighting. Over the next 100 and some years, the Templars found themselves retreating from one fortified prefectory to another across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. No matter how successful they were in business, and no matter how dedicated they were, in the eyes of the Pope and the Catholic kings and the nobles of Europe, the main purpose of the Templars and the other Crusaders was to secure the Holy Land for Christ, and this they did not do. What's more, the Templars were exceedingly rich. What's more, Papal orders had made the Templars exempt from all local taxes in Catholic Europe. They were literally a law unto themselves. The knights were also very secretive. The rites they practiced inside the prefectories, which in truth were likely a little different than the rites practiced by high officials of the Catholic Church and other military orders, were the subject of rumor. The unknown always is, especially in a time of ignorance. Additionally, the leader of the Knights Templar, called the Grand Master, was a lifetime position and commanded great power, respect, and wealth. Many Grand Masters led from the front, however, and were killed in battle, sometimes after only a short time in office. However, a lifetime appointed to lead a secret order who had to follow no laws but their own in whatever kingdom they were in made the Knights Templar the enemies of many powerful people. In 1306, the most powerful of these enemies was King Philip IV of France and his relative Pope Clement V. Adding to the strength of the duo was the fact at the time the Pope lived in Avignon, France. Many people would not lend money to friends because it tends to ruin friendships. One of the ways in which this happened is that the person who is loaned the money, instead of blaming themselves for getting into debt, blames their friend for asking for the money back. Happens today, and it happened in 1306 to 1307. Philip IV had borrowed tremendous sums of money from the Templars, money he had no ability nor desire to pay back. Over the years, the Templars had been given much land in France, land which no longer generated income for the king or his nobles, or in many cases, the church. Both Philip and Clement had an idea of how much wealth the Templars had, and they wanted it. So they invited Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitallers for negotiations. These negotiations were supposed to settle serious differences between the orders and perhaps see if they could be merged into one powerful order of knights. Unfortunately for de Molay, this was a ruse. The Hospitallers' Grand Master was delayed for months, and while waiting, the Pope began to ask de Molay about criminal accusations brought by a former knight a couple of years prior. Upon hearing this, Philip pressured his cousin to investigate rumors that had been circulating around the Templars for years, rumors of unholy rites. These unholy rites included the worship of a goat-headed god called Baphomet, the appearance of a skull at the Templar-initiated rites, which was rumored to be that of an unholy two-headed or two-faced beast, or the dried head of John the Baptist. Among other accusations were rampant homosexual activity among the Templars, and initiation rites, which included stepping on the cross, urinating on an image of Christ, and much more. These accusations were made by Templars themselves. Why? Because they had been arrested, along with Jacques de Molay. By the way, they were arrested on Friday the 13th, 1307. This is mistakenly believed to be the origin of Friday the 13th being the unlucky day. But while the number 13 had been considered unlucky by the Romans and some others in Europe, the mention of unlucky Friday the 13th does not appear in history until the 1800s. Still, the day was unlucky enough for the Templars, for they were tortured for days, weeks, and months while the trial of the Templars was conducted. Of course, the poor men told their torturers anything to make the pain stop, if only for a moment. This is the source of the wild charges made against de Molay and the Templars. On March 18, 1314, de Molay and scores of others were burned alive at the stake as heretics. Throughout Western Europe, the prefectories were raided and Templars killed or jailed. Some were allowed to join other orders. The Order of Christ and the Supreme Order of Christ were formed in Portugal by former Templars who enjoyed the Portuguese king's protection and were considered by some to be the heirs of the Knights Templar. But perhaps Jacques de Molay got his revenge. He is said to have uttered a curse before his death, telling the crowd around him that both the king and pope would be dead within a year, and their king's line would come to an end shortly thereafter. Both Philip IV and Clement V died within 12 months, and Philip's line died out shortly thereafter. In 2006, Pope Benedict XVI officially apologized to the Order of the Knights Templar on behalf of the Catholic Church for the imprisonment, torture, and deaths that followed their persecution 700 years before. Benedict knew that the perspective of the Knights Templar and the accusations against the Knights Templar were false, and many had suspected that very thing for centuries.